Convoy Command in action. American bombers arriving at a transfer point in Canada, aerial crossroads of the world. United States Army pilots turn the ships over to a Royal Air Force crew for the long trip overseas. Down the runway, outward bound. Canada, Britain, and the United States launching the greatest sky offensive the world has ever seen. Canada's newest light bomber, called the Mosquito, is shown to the public for the first time. Air Force officers are keenly interested. Built of wood, it's said to outmaneuver and outdistance many fighter planes now in action. Test pilot de Havilland, son of the famous designer, takes it aloft. Speed and range a military secret, the Mosquito is said to be the fastest bomber in the world. Even when flying on only one of its powerful twin motors, Canada's Mosquito bomber carries a deadly sting. The United States Army has a new and radical little plane too. Designed to go wherever ground troops can go, it needs remarkably little space to take off. And it climbs like a shot. Carrying pilot and an observer or cameraman, the ship is highly maneuverable and invaluable for reconnaissance. Capable of landing on almost any field, the tiny plane can turn around and get back in the air in a flash. The infantry's newest sky soldier. Canada's answer to Nazi U-boat sinkings. First films of the Dominion's fast new fleet of submarine chasers in action. Picking up a convoy, they test their new anti-submarine gun. Built for terrific speeds, they cut the water like a knife. Equipped with powerful depth charges carrying higher explosive power, they can blow up or cripple a lurking U-boat in more than twice the area possible a few months ago. Here's a sample. And in 30 seconds, another's ready to go over the side. That, says the skipper, is that. Final late winter training for fresh Canadian artillery, now ordered overseas. Training that includes the handling of dynamite in doses big enough to blast a bridge or a mountain. Training that equips men to fight with any and all weapons. Training for the Allied invasion of Europe. Ready to leave for embarkation points, they go to swell the increasing numbers of United Nations forces gathering for the big thrust upon the Nazi-held continent. Volunteers making a journey more than 3,000 miles from home to fight for a cause they know is just. Trainloads of Canadian-built tanks follow the troops to the coast. Here in the fog and sea mist of departing winter, the big convoys assemble. Cargoes of war swing over the sides of waiting merchantmen. Trucks from Ontario, scout cars from Quebec, Lend-Lease equipment and supplies from the United States. Working 24 hours a day to meet sailing time, the men of the Merchant Navy are doing their jobs well. The unlimited resources of North and South America united in delivering the goods as the convoys continue to go through. At a Canadian airport, a transatlantic glider, given the African name of Voodoo, is loaded to cross the Atlantic. Its lone pilot is an RAF squadron leader. Among its cargo is the first letter ever destined to span the Atlantic in a glider. Carrying 1.5 tons of war material, including medical supplies and machine parts for aircraft factories in England, the Voodoo takes off towed by a twin-engine transport, the first transatlantic freight train of the skies. Hours later, transport and glider landed safely at a British airport. 3,500 miles, forerunner of a regular service of air trains that may span the Atlantic in days to come. To the historic citadel of Quebec comes Britain's fighting leader, Prime Minister Churchill, for important military conferences with United Nations leaders. Welcomed by Mackenzie King, Dominion Prime Minister, Mr. Churchill brings his wife and daughter Mary, a subaltern in Britain's Auxiliary Territorial Service. At Quebec's picturesque Chateau Frontenac, scene of the first conferences, Canadians of French descent give Mr. Churchill a rousing welcome. Today, his V for victory is more than a gesture of defiance. It is a symbol of achievement. Mrs. Churchill is popular here too. Her untiring efforts in behalf of Britain's war-torn families have endeared her to the people. This is the first time she has given up her war work long enough to accompany her famous husband on one of his many journeys. While Mrs. Churchill rested in Quebec, the Prime Minister visited President Roosevelt in the United States. Now, Mr. Churchill and his official party await the arrival of Mr. Roosevelt in Canada. Here, with other United Nations leaders, new drives are being mapped to bring the Axis to the terms of Casablanca, unconditional surrender.
Some of the great Canadian Army meet the Canadian Prime Minister, a long way from Canada. Mr. Mackenzie King, in England for the Empire Conference, reviews the men, volunteers all of them, who are now ready and set for the long, rumbling ride over the thundering battlefield that is the road to Germany. Men of Canada's magnificent land fleet, powerful arm of the Allied spearhead that is poised and pointing at the enemy across the Channel.
The Atlantic wall has been penetrated. There, after the first assault, the Allies clung precariously to a few beaches. But now they have a solid foothold on Fortress Europa. Men and material have poured onto the newly won beachheads with every favorable tide, and on some unfavorable ones. The Allied command has announced that the Battle of the Beaches is complete. The tremendous offensive was bitterly contested. The Nazis knew that each passing hour diminished their chances of throwing the Allies back into the sea. But the American, British, and Canadian troops pressed forward firmly onto the soil of France and made contact with the French people. This was no pushover, driving the Germans back. Some of our troops dropped within yards of the water's edge. There were two enemies, the Germans and the heavy seas. German prisoners were taken almost at once. American and British aircraft supported the shock troops magnificently, preventing the Germans from marshalling reinforcements. American marauders plastered peaceful-looking forests, the hiding places of Nazi tank formations and vicious dumps of high explosive. With beaches free of enemy fire, the Allies streamed heavy equipment ashore. Lumbering bulldozers set about clearing the way for vital air landing strips. The blast of Allied shells left shattered German defenses and many dead German defenders. Survivors were given prompt attention by medical corps men. Some were grateful, many bewildered by the smashing Allied blow. Doughboys and Tommies pushed forward yard by yard into the villages and small towns. And more prisoners fell into their hands. Some were still arrogant, reluctant to raise their hands in defeat. Landing craft carried the captives back to England. This then is Hitler's invasion of Britain. They come now, defeated men, to the confinement behind barbed wire.
In Holland, the British Second Army resumes its offensive after a comparative lull in order to bring up supplies for the assault. Trapping the Germans near the mouth of the Scheldt, the British and Canadians slog ahead on three fronts. These operations are strategically designed to liberate the port of Antwerp for Allied supplies. Here, time runs out for these German troops.
Underground pictures have caught the desperate German flight from Antwerp. The Belgians tore down road signs and made every effort to impede and confuse the Nazi exodus. Mysterious defects appeared in Nazi transport, further slowing the enemy retreat. There was hardly time to unfurl the flags before British and Canadian tanks streaked in on the heels of the Germans. Belgians took their first joyride in 3 years. The Nazis were not even given time for their usual work of demolition. Their eyes were on the false security of the threatened Siegfried Line. Belgian resentment was exercised bitterly against collaborators. Their homes were stripped and furniture demolished. The Belgian Maquis thwarted the flight of many of the Germans and paraded their catch back to the Allied prisoner cages. The port of Antwerp was left almost intact and may soon become another great Allied supply funnel. At the moment, the Nazis are fighting bitterly on its water approaches, attempting to keep the port immobilized. But time and the tide of Allied military power are engaged in bringing this resistance to an end.
August 1941. President Roosevelt and Prime Minister Churchill at sea meet to draw up the Atlantic Charter. Then Casablanca, January 1943, and plans for the liberation of France. Then Tehran, that helped to seal the fate of the German armies. Now into a Quebec station comes an official train carrying England's Prime Minister Winston Churchill. Accompanied by Mrs. Churchill and Mackenzie King, Churchill walks to a nearby auto to meet once more with America's President Franklin Roosevelt. One of the most important points on the agenda, this their 8th conference, Roosevelt and Churchill are expected to discuss plans for the future conduct of the war in the Pacific. The American and British leaders proceed to the historic Quebec Citadel, where they last met 13 months ago, on the Citadel parade grounds. With Allied troops on German soil, Roosevelt and Churchill prepare for one of the most significant of all their conferences. Lancaster bombers over LeHAVRE, great channel port at the mouth of the Seine. Incendiary target markers fill the air, followed by a rain of bombs on German military installations. After a 36-hour combined air and artillery assault, men and arms of General Crayar's Canadian First Army move into the outskirts of the second largest port of all France. Following German surrender, our forces enter the city. Le Havre, as a military port, will require extensive reconstruction. On the English side of the channel, 15-inch coastal guns open a devastating artillery barrage against the entrenched enemy in Boulogne. 1-ton shells hurtle on their way. Boulogne falls to Canadian forces. The bitter fight, due to the long continued enemy resistance, has reduced most of the port to rubble. Here at Boulogne, as isolated German coastal strongholds fall one by one, 9,000 prisoners are taken, adding to the more than 1 million Nazi casualties since D-Day. Their army now draws heavily on ill-suited replacement material. Calais. A final bombing as the prelude to enemy surrender. All civilians evacuated, the RAF smashes German gun positions only 27 miles across the channel from England. Anti-aircraft brings down one of our planes, but the crew bails out in safety. In furious assault, the air forces paved the way for capture of Calais by Allied ground forces and the cleaning up of the important channel ports.
The German 7th Army is being ground to pieces in the jaws of gigantic Allied armored forces. General Crerar, Canadian Commander-in-Chief, is given final instructions in the master plan by General Montgomery himself. Few days had passed before the German 7th was in full flight, struggling to reach the Falaise Gap before the Allied jaws snapped shut. The enemy was in a perilous situation when staggering numbers of American, British, and Canadian bombers went in for the kill. Escape bridges were pounded to uselessness. The Allies were determined that the vaunted 7th Army should be mortally crippled. The fields of Normandy have become its graveyard. Meanwhile, destruction of Germany's flying bomb sites goes forward. More and more of the so-called revenge weapons are being exploded in midair. Here are remarkable pictures of 2 robots that failed to accomplish their mission. The French town with a questionable name, Laval, has been liberated. It was one of the first places taken by the Americans as they smashed eastward from Rennes to cut off the German escape routes. German posters were defaced and pulled down. While some troops remained to garrison the town, the main column drove to Le Mans, north to Alençon, and raced to close the gap at Falaise. In the Canadian sector, powerful artillery units helped unhinge the German defenses. An American flying fortress is shot down by anti-aircraft fire, but the crew managed to bail out. They are warmly greeted by their buddies after their narrow escape. Among the most damaging weapons of the Normandy campaign are the deadly rocket-firing Typhoons. Their accuracy and destructiveness have bewildered the enemy. The Nazis have tried repeatedly to mount a daylight counterattack, but thanks to these planes, they have found it next to impossible. The flight of the enemy has reached a point of desperation. He is not even able to contend with the Allied forces already on the continent. Now comes news of further Allied landings on the south coast of France. As General Eisenhower has stated, this has been a climactic week for the Allies, a fateful one for the forces of Nazi tyranny.